I have served 30 years in the silent service, and in all that time I learned exactly one thing worth passing down. The deep does not reward the loud. It rewards the patient. It rewards the man or the woman who can sit in the dark longer than the other fellow can stand it. I came to that lesson late, and I came to it the hard way, and I owe the whole of it to a young lieutenant I once swore had no business standing watch on my boat. Her name was Mara Quinn. The crew came to call her by her call sign before that last patrol was over, and I have never said the word the same way since. You have to understand what I was, that spring, to understand how far I had to come. I was a senior chief sonar technician with more sea time than half the wardroom had years of life. I had grown up on diesel boats and finished my career on the new fast attacks, and I had heard the screws of more hostile vessels through a pair of headphones than most men in the Navy will hear in 3 lifetimes. I knew the sound of trouble the way a farmer knows the smell of rain. And I had a contempt for officers who came to the boat soft, who had learned the trade from a screen and a manual and a clean classroom, who had never once felt their own pulse hammering in their throat while a real hull groaned under real pressure and a real enemy hunted overhead. I thought I had earned that contempt. I thought it was wisdom. It was not. It was the loudest thing about me, and the deep does not reward the loud. We were tied up at the pier the morning I first heard her dismissed, and the dismissing was done by a man with a great deal more rank than sense. His name was Prout. He was a squadron staff officer, an 06 with a desk and a temper, and a way of speaking to enlisted men as though we were furniture that could hear, and he had come down to the boat for the pre-patrol brief because the orders we were about to receive were the kind that made staff officers want to be seen near them. We were headed into the Sable Strait. I will not draw you a map, and I could not if I wanted to, but you can picture it well enough. A long contested gut of water between 2 chains of islands, deep in the middle and treacherous along the edges, with a great undersea shelf we called the Coronal Bank rising up out of the dark like the back of a sleeping animal. There was a hostile surface group operating in those waters that month, and there had been incidents, and we were being sent to listen and watch, and if the order came, to do considerably more than listen. It was the kind of patrol that gets a boat remembered, one way or the other. The wardroom was crowded for the brief. Officers and chiefs and a scattering of the watch leaders, all of us packed into a space the size of a walk-in pantry, and the air already going thick with the smell of coffee and machinery and too many men. Lieutenant Quinn was up front. She was our weapons and sensors officer that patrol, which is a polite way of saying she would have the con for the tactical fight if a tactical fight came, and she was young for it, young enough that you noticed. She had a quiet way about her, a stillness that I read at the time as inexperience and later understood was something else entirely. She did not fidget. She did not fill silence with talk. She stood at the chart with her hands folded behind her and let other men make noise. Prout made noise. He let her get about 3 sentences into the threat picture, the surface group, the patrol box, the layer conditions over the Coronal Bank before he interrupted her, and he did it with a smile, which is always the worst way. He asked her in front of every man in that room how many real patrols she'd actually stood. He let the word real sit there. He said he'd read her record, said it was a fine record, a school record, top of every course the Navy could put a young officer through. Then he asked her whether she had ever once in her whole career heard a live hostile screw on real water with her own ears, or whether she'd only ever heard them in a schoolhouse, in a trainer, in a simulator with the lights up and an instructor at her elbow ready to push the pause button. She said evenly that she had stood the watches in her record. He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was worse than cruel, it was easy. He told the room as though it were a joke we were all in on that the modern Navy had taught its young people to fight wars the way children fought them on a screen, and that we'd handed this fine young officer a video game and called it a qualification. He called her the simulator queen. He said it twice so it would stick. He said real anti-submarine work was not a game you could pause, that the Strait did not care how many courses you'd aced, and that he hoped to God the captain would be on his feet for the whole patrol, because the Strait was no place to be learning your trade for the first time with 130 souls aboard. I want to tell you that I bristled at that. I want to tell you that my 30 years rose up in defense of a young officer being humiliated by a man who had never once been where she was about to go. But that would be a lie, and I have done with lies about that patrol. The truth is that I agreed with him. I stood at the back of that crowded wardroom with my arms crossed, and I thought, the man is right, even if he's a fool for saying it out loud. I thought, I do not want the simulator queen at the con if it comes to a real fight in the Strait. I thought, give me a real submariner. I had decided who she was before we ever slipped the lines, and I had decided it on the strength of her youth and her quiet and a staff officer's easy laugh, and I carried that decision down the gangway and onto the boat as though it were a fact and not the cheapest kind of guess. She did not argue with Prout. That was the first thing about her that I should have noticed and did not. She did not defend her record or raise her voice or let the heat come into her face. She waited until he was done and then she went on with the threat picture exactly where she'd left off, calm as still water, and she finished the brief, and not one man in that room could have told you afterward that she'd been rattled because she had not been. I read that as a young officer who didn't have the spine to push back. I had it precisely backward. She had the kind of spine that doesn't need to be shown. We got underway that afternoon. There is a feeling when a boat slips beneath the surface for the last time before a patrol, a settling, the way a house settles at night, and the surface world with all its noise and laughter and easy men goes away and there is only the boat and the sea and the dark. I have loved that feeling all my life. I felt it that day with the squadron officer's words still in my ears, and I remember being glad he was ashore, glad the deep had closed over us and taken his kind of noise away, even as I carried his judgment of the lieutenant down into the quiet with me like a stone in my pocket. The first days of the patrol were what patrols mostly are, which is to say long and uneventful and demanding in a way that has nothing to do with combat. The Sable Strait is a difficult piece of water even with no enemy in it. The Cornell Bank threw up sound in strange ways, bending it, hiding things, the cold water and the warm water layered over each other like the pages of a wet book, so that a contact could be 1,000 yards away and sound like 10 miles, or be 10 miles off and seem to be right under the keel. We ran quiet and we ran careful and we mapped what we could, and I sat my watches in sonar with my best technicians around me and listened to the sea breathe. It was during those quiet days that I started, against my own intentions, to notice things about the lieutenant. The first was the layer. The thermal layer in the strait was a living thing, shifting with the day and the tide and the runoff from the islands, and most officers treated it as a nuisance to be tolerated, a number on a readout. Lieutenant Quinn treated it as the most important fact in our world. She had a way of coming into sonar on the midwatch when the boat was hushed and the off-going men were in their racks and there was nobody to perform for, and she would sit down quietly beside one of my younger technicians and ask him what the layer was doing. Not what the readout said, what it was doing. And she would listen to him work through it, and she would ask him a question that made him hear something he'd missed, and then she would thank him and go away again, and the boy would sit there a little taller than he had before. She did that on the midwatch where there was no prute to impress, no record to burnish, nobody to see. I told myself it didn't mean anything. It meant everything, and I was too proud to read it. The second thing was the way she had pre-mapped the bank. We carried on every boat the standard tactical products, the charts and the predictions and the doctrine. The lieutenant carried more. She had built on her own time in the quiet hours a kind of private model of the Cornell Bank in the strait, where the cold water pooled and where it spilled, where a boat could hide in the shadow of the rising shelf and where the sound would carry a contact screws straight to a hunter's ears. She had marked the seams in the layer where a quiet boat could slip from one acoustic world to another and vanish. I saw it laid out on her chart one night and I thought it was a fine academic exercise, the kind of thing the simulator queen would do, all theory and ink. I did not understand that she had built us a map of how to disappear before we ever needed to disappear, and that she had built it the way a man builds a lifeboat in fair weather, hopping never to launch it. The third thing, and I am ashamed of how long it took me to credit it, was the enemy. There was a particular hostile vessel operating in the strait that month, a destroyer, the lead ship of the hunter group, and she was good. I knew it from her screws the first time we heard her at the far edge of detection. Most surface ships are loud and lazy in the way they hunt a submarine, churning back and forth, throwing their sound around like a drunk throwing punches. This one was not. This one moved like a man who had hunted before, who would go quiet himself for long stretches, who would change his pattern just when you thought you'd learned it, who used the layer and the bank against us the same way we tried to use them against him. I respected that screw the way one craftsman respects another across a great distance, and I learned over those quiet days that the lieutenant respected it too, that she had been studying that destroyer's commander for far longer than this patrol. She had built a picture of the man, the way he turned, the intervals he held, the little tells and how he worked his sonar when he was confident and when he was guessing. She knew him. She had done the work nobody made her do on a hunter she had never seen against a day she prayed would not come, and she had done it quietly on the midwatch where no staff officer would ever see it and call it real. I had her measured as the simulator queen. The simulator queen, it turned out, had measured the entire strait and the man hunting in it and had told no one because she was not the kind to tell. The day it came began like any other and turned in the space of 90 seconds, the way these things do. He had moved up onto the western shoulder of the Cornell Bank to hold a listening station, and the captain, Commander Ostrander, a steady old hand we all called the old man, the kind of skipper who'd forgotten more about the strait than most men ever learned, had the con himself. The layer was doing something strange that morning, lifting and breaking up over the bank in a way that none of us liked, and the contact picture was a mess. The hunter group somewhere off to the north, half heard, half guessed. We were threading the boat carefully through the seams the lieutenant had mapped, trying to stay in the acoustic shadow of the rising shelf when the sea gave us almost no warning at all. The lead destroyer had gone quiet on us, fully quiet, and she had not been where we thought. The first hard sign we had that the hunter had found us was the sound through the hull of her active sonar, a hammer blow of energy that came not from the north where we'd placed her but from the southeast, close, much too close, the sound rolling through the boat and up through the soles of our feet. She had slipped the layer. She had used the same seam in the water that the lieutenant had found, and she had come down our throat with the bank to her back so that we never heard her coming. And now, she had us pinned against the shoulder of the coronal bank with deep water on one side and shoaling rock on the other, and the whole hunter group turning toward the racket to close the trap. The old man did everything right, I want that said. He was a fine submariner and he reacted in the first half-second, ordering the boat down into port into the deeper water, trying to put the bank between us and the hunter and get us below the layer into the cold water where their sonar would lose us. It was the correct call and he made it instantly. But the sea had one more cruelty waiting, and it was nothing the old man could have foreseen and nothing his skill could have answered. As the boat angled down and heeled into the turn, going for the deep, we struck something. Not the bank, we never touched the rock, the old man's turn saw to that. We struck an uncharted pinnacle of the coronal bank itself, a spire of rock that rose up out of the dark where no chart said it should be, and we struck it a glancing blow along the forward hull and the boat shuddered like a living thing taking a wound. The lights flickered, men were thrown against frames and consoles. And forward, in the control room, the old man was pitched off his feet and his head struck the steel edge of the periscope stand and he went down and he did not get up. I was not in control at that instant. I was in sonar, 3 steps aft, and what I heard was the impact and then the chaos, the shouted reports, the corpsman called forward, the boat fighting to recover her trim with water coming in somewhere forward and a hostile destroyer overhead and the rest of the hunter group bearing down. I came out of my chair and I got to the control room door and I saw the corpsman kneeling over the old man and I saw the blood, and I saw that the captain of our boat was unconscious on the deck and was going to stay that way. And I felt, for one cold instant, the bottom drop out of everything. Because I knew what the chain of command said, I knew who had the con now. She was already standing it. I do not know exactly when she took it. Somewhere in those first seconds, in the chaos and the dark and the alarms, while grown men with 20 years of sea time were still finding their feet, Lieutenant Mara Quinn had stepped into the center of that control room and taken command of a wounded boat in a closing trap, and she had done it so quietly that half the men did not realize the con had changed hands until they heard her voice. And her voice, I will remember her voice on that morning until the day I die, her voice was not raised. It did not shake. It was the same still water it had been at the chart in the wardroom while a staff officer laughed at her. It came out of the smoke and the alarm haze low and clear and absolutely level, and it gave orders and the orders were right. She did not order us deep, that was the thing. Every instinct in that control room, including every instinct in me, screamed to drive the boat down into the cold water and run. She did not. She had felt in the way the boat handled, what the casualty report was a half-minute from confirming, that the glancing strike had hurt us forward, that we had flooding she had to control and a hull she could not fully trust at depth, and that if she drove a wounded boat hard for the bottom we might not stop where she wanted us to. She also knew, because she had built the map nobody asked her to build, that the deep water to port did not save us anyway. It put us out from under the shadow of the bank, into open water where the whole hunter group could work us at their leisure. So she did the thing that no simulator would have rewarded and no easy man would have dared. She took us up, not to the surface, toward the layer. She brought the wounded boat shallow and tucked it hard against the rising shoulder of the coronal bank, into the exact acoustic shadow she had mapped on her quiet midnight watches, into the seam in the water where the cold and the warm folded over each other and swallowed sound. She put the bank between us and the hunter group to the north. She put the broken layer between us and the destroyer that had pinned us. And then she did the thing that took more nerve than any maneuver I ever watched a man perform. She stopped. She brought the boat to a near hover in the shadow of the bank, trimmed it neutral with a delicacy I would not have believed possible from a hull that had just taken a hit, and she ordered the boat to go silent. Fully silent. Not the running silence we used on patrol, true silence, the deep kind, every unnecessary system secured, every man frozen at his station, the corpsman working on the old man by feel in the half-dark with his tools wrapped in cloth, so they would not ring against the steel. She killed everything that turned and everything that hummed. She made 130 men into one held breath. And she settled us into the shadow of the coronal bank with a destroyer's crew listening for us a few hundred yards away, and she waited for them to talk themselves into believing we had run. I have been in some hard places in 30 years. I have never been anywhere as hard as the next 9 hours. You cannot understand what silent running like that does to a crew unless you have lived it. The boat is hot because you have secured the things that cool it. The air goes stale and close. You cannot speak above a breath. You cannot drop a wrench, cannot cough hard, cannot let a hatch ring. And overhead, getting nearer and then sliding away and then coming back, are the screws of men whose entire purpose is to find you and end you. And you sit in the dark and you listen to them hunt, and you do nothing because the lieutenant has decided that doing nothing, done perfectly, is how 130 men go home. I went back to my sonar shack and I put on my headphones and I became, for those 9 hours, her ears. And that is where I came to know who she actually was, because I heard the whole duel through my own equipment and I watched her read it move by move from across the boat, and I understood at last that I had spent my whole career thinking I was the finest set of ears in the silent service, and that I had been wrong, and that the finest set of ears in the silent service was a quiet young officer the Navy had handed me, with a staff officer's laugh still ringing. She came back to the sonar shack within the first half hour, once the boat was settled and silent and the trap was set. She did not crowd me. She crouched down beside my chair the way she had crouched beside my young technicians on the mid-watch, and she put on a spare set of phones and she listened with me. And for the first time I understood the thing she did that no school can teach. She did not hear the destroyer's screws. She heard the destroyer's mind. She listened to the way that hostile commander worked the water, the legs he ran, the turns he made, the intervals he held his active sonar and the intervals he went passive to listen, and she read his confidence and his doubt the way I read a printout. She would touch my arm lightly and breathe a few words, barely a sound. He thinks we ran north, he's working the open water. He'll come back to the bank when the others find nothing. And then 20 minutes later the destroyer would do precisely what she had whispered it would do, and she would already have moved us a few degrees, a few feet. A tiny adjustment of trim to slide us deeper into the shadow as the layer shifted with the tide, so that when the hunter came back to the bank to check it again, the seam in the water had closed over us a little tighter, and there was a little less of us for him to find. She did that for hours. The destroyer commander was good. I told you he was good, and the duel proved it. He did not give up the way a lesser man would have. He came back to the bank again and again. He went quiet and tried to creep up on the shadow the way he'd crept up on us the first time. He pinged actively, hard, trying to flush us with sound, and each time that hammer rolled through the hull every man on the boat flinched and the lieutenant did not. She only listened to how the sound came back and adjusted us a hair to stay in the dead water where his energy could not paint us. He worked the layer. He worked the bank. He brought the rest of his group in and quartered the water around the coronal bank in a grid, methodical, patient, a hunter who knew his trade. And against that hunter in a wounded boat with her captain bleeding on the deck behind her and 130 men's lives in her hands, Lieutenant Quinn was simply better. Not louder, not luckier, better. She had done the work he had done and more of it, and she had done it on him specifically, and she sat in the dark and outthought him hour after hour after hour with a calm that came up off her like cold off ice. I will tell you the moment I broke. There was an hour somewhere in the middle of it when the flooding forward got ahead of the men fighting it, and the boat began very slightly to grow heavy by the bow. You could feel it, a wrongness in the deck, and the destroyer chose that exact hour to make his closest pass, his screws building until they filled my phones, until I was certain that he had us, that the next thing I would hear would be the splash of the weapon entering the water above our heads. And I took off my headphones because I could not stand to hear it come, and I looked at the lieutenant, and I think she saw the surrender in my face. The simulator queen, I had called her in my heart. I looked at her in that hour expecting to see the same fear I felt. And what I saw was a young woman with her eyes half closed, listening, perfectly still, her hand resting flat on the deck as though she could feel the boat's pulse through it, and she breathed 3 words to the trim and dive watch without ever opening her eyes that corrected the bow heaviness by the smallest margin and held us in the shadow, and the destroyer's screws reached their peak directly above us, and held and then slowly began to draw away to the north. He had passed within a few hundred yards of 130 men and he had not heard a thing because she had not let him. I put my headphones back on with hands that shook, and she had already turned back to the water, listening for his next mistake, and there was no triumph in her face at all. There was only the work. I understood in that hour that I was in the presence of something I had never once seen in 30 years, and that I had laughed at it 3 weeks before on a sunlit pier. She held us in that shadow for 9 hours. 9 hours of held breath, 9 hours of stale hot air and the corpsmen keeping the old man alive by feel, and the damage control parties fighting the flooding silent and savage in the forward spaces, passing tools hand to hand wrapped in cloth, not a word spoken above a breath. 9 hours of the hunter group working the water around the coronal bank and finding nothing because there was nothing to find that she had not hidden. And slowly, the way it does when patience wins, the hunt began to die. The screws spread out. The active sonar came less often, then rarely, then not at all. The destroyer commander, that good and patient man, ran out of places to look and ran out of certainty. And at the long last he began to believe what she had spent 9 hours making him believe. which was that the wounded American boat had slipped away to the deep in those first chaotic seconds and was long gone. The hunter group began to draw off to the north to widen their search to chase a boat that had never moved. And it was then, when a lesser tactician would have simply sighed in relief and crept away in the other direction grateful to be alive, that Lieutenant Quinn showed me the last thing, the thing that turns competence into something closer to art. She did not run. She had been studying that destroyer's commander for longer than that patrol, and she knew one more thing about him that the rest of us did not, and it was this: that when he believed he had lost a contact, he turned for home along a particular line, a habit a tell the same way every time, drawing off to the north along the eastern edge of the bank where the deep water ran. She had marked it on the map nobody asked her to build. She knew that if she waited, if she held silent just a little longer, let him commit fully to the belief that we were gone, let him settle onto that homeward line with his guard down and his sonar slack and his stern presented, there would come one window narrow and clean, where the hunter who had nearly killed us would put himself directly across the seam in the water she had hidden us in. At a range and a bearing she had been building a firing solution for patiently, silently, hour after hour. While the rest of us only tried to survive. She had not been hiding for 9 hours, I understood it all at once. She had been hiding, yes, but she had also been hunting. The whole time, she had let him believe he was the hunter and we were the prey, and she had used the 9 hours not only to survive but to assemble move by trim and bearing and the patient reading of one man's habits, a single perfect shot that could not miss. She had not been waiting to escape, she had been waiting for him. When the window opened, it opened exactly where she had said it would. The destroyer, satisfied at last that we were gone, settled onto his homeward line along the eastern edge of the bank, screws steady, sonar quiet, stern toward the shadow where we lay. And Lieutenant Quinn opened her eyes and she gave the order to bring the weapon to bear, and there was nothing rushed in it and nothing loud. The firing solution was already there. She had built it in the dark across 9 hours the way another officer might build it across 9 seconds of panic, except that hers could not fail because she had not guessed at a single number in it. She had measured everyone. When she gave the order to fire, she gave it the way you might mention the time of day. I heard the weapon leave the boat. I heard it run, true and straight along the line she had laid for it, into the seam in the water and out the other side, toward a hunter who never knew until the last instant that the prey he had given up for lost had been sitting in his shadow the entire day, building his end. I heard, at the finish of it, the thing you do not forget. And then I heard the straight go quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 9 hours, the screws of the hunter group scattering northward now in shock and confusion, running from a boat they could not find that had risen up out of nothing to take their leader. And I sat in my sonar shack with 30 years of pride in ruins around me in tears. I am not ashamed to say it now, running down an old man's face into his beard. She did not gloat. I want that recorded most of all. There was no triumph in the control room when the report came, no cheering, because she would not have it, and because the men looking at her understood that cheering would have been a kind of obscenity in the presence of what she had just done. She had not won a game. She had kept 130 men alive against a hunter better than any of us, including me, had ever faced, and she had done it through patience and silence and nerve, and 1,000 hours of quiet, unglamorous work that no staff officer would ever have called real. She stood in the center of the control room with the old man's blood still dark on the deck behind her, and she gave the orders to bring the boat carefully off the bottom of that long-held breath, to begin to ease us out of the strait toward the deep water and home, and her voice was exactly as level as it had been 9 hours before and 3 weeks before, still water all the way down. We surfaced at dawn, clear of the strait at last, in open ocean under a sky just going pale. The relieving force was waiting for us, ships that had been racing toward our last reported position through the whole long night, and they came up around us as the sun broke the horizon, and the word of what had happened in the Sable Strait was already running through the fleet faster than any boat could carry it. I was on the bridge when we came up. I had asked the lieutenant for permission to go topside and she had granted it, and I stood there in the cold dawn air after 9 hours in the held breath of the deep, and I filled my lungs, and I looked up at the last stars going out in the lightning sky, and I thought of a thing she had said to my young technicians more than once on the mid-watch, a thing I had heard and dismissed. She told them the sea gives the strait to whoever can stay quiet the longest. I had thought it was the kind of thing a textbook officer says. It was the truest thing anyone ever taught me about my own trade, and a child of the simulator had taught it to me, and I had needed to nearly die to learn it. The old man lived. The corpsman had kept him breathing through the whole long silence, and he came around 2 days later in a fleet hospital, and the first thing he asked, they told me, was who had the con, and when they told him, he closed his eyes and he smiled and he said, of course she did. He had known. The old man, who had forgotten more about the strait than I would ever learn, had known what she was the whole time and had said nothing because she was not the kind to want it said, and neither, it turned out, was he. It was on the pier that the rest of it came out and that I learned the last thing about her, the thing that explained everything. We came into port to a reception no submarine crew of my long memory had ever received. The word had run ahead of us, and standing on the pier in his pressed uniform, in the front rank of the men assembled to meet us, was the squadron officer, Prout, the man who had called her the simulator queen in a crowded wardroom 3 weeks before, who had asked her in front of God and the crew whether she'd ever heard a real screw or only ever a schoolhouse one. He was on that pier, and his face was the gray of a man who has spent a sleepless night reading a record he should have read more carefully the first time. And as the lieutenant came down the brow, he came to attention and he held it, and he did not laugh. A young officer near me, a fresh ensign who had stood the whole patrol white-knuckled and silent, asked one of the chiefs in a low voice why a full captain was standing at attention for a lieutenant, and the chief, old Hollies, who'd been around even longer than I had told him. He said the staff officer, when he'd called her the simulator queen, had not known what every senior man in the squadron knew and had not thought to look up. He said that years before, when Lieutenant Quinn was a junior officer barely out of her qualification, she had been aboard a boat that took a casualty far worse than ours, deep in a strait that the whole Navy had written off as a tomb the moment the distress call cut out. He said the boat had been flooding and crippled and given up for lost by every staff officer ashore, including some who were ashore on this pier today. And he said that a junior officer nobody had ever heard of had taken the con of a dying boat and held it silent and brought it back through that strait against every odds and every prediction alone on patience and nerve, with not one man lost, and that the boat had a quiet way of remembering her after that. He said they had started calling her by a name on that long-ago patrol, the only name the strait had left her, and that the name had followed her quiet through every command since, spoken low, the way you speak of something you half believe is a legend. He said they called her Fathom. Fathom, a measure of the deep, the unit of how far down a thing goes. I stood on that pier with my 30 years and I heard the name, and I understood that I had served alongside the legend I had heard told in chief's messes for years, and had never once connected to the quiet young officer I'd written off on a sunny morning, and that the Navy in its mercy had given an old proud man one last patrol to learn the only lesson he'd never managed to learn, taught by the very person he'd been too proud to credit. She came down the brow last after the crew the way she did everything without performance, and the squadron officer held his salute, and then, as she passed him, the order ran down the assembled ranks, and it was the captain's voice, Prout's voice, the same voice that had laughed at her in the wardroom, and it did not laugh now. It called the formation to attention and it rendered honors, and 100 men came to attention on that pier for a lieutenant, and the captain who had mocked her stood frozen in his salute as she passed, and I watched his face as she went by, and there was nothing in it but the cold gray knowledge of a man learning, far too late and in front of the whole fleet, exactly what he had laughed at. She returned the honors with a quiet nod, no more, and went on up the pier into the morning. She had not raised her voice once in 9 hours or in 3 weeks. She had not gloated, had not gleamed, had not asked for any of it. Her power had been her composure and her patience and her absolute mastery of a trade I had thought I owned, and she had spent every hour of that patrol proving it not to us but simply doing it, because doing it was what she was, with or without an audience, with or without a staff officer's leave. I went and found her before she left the waterfront. I do not entirely know what I meant to say. I had carried a staff officer's judgment of her down into the deep 3 weeks before like a stone in my pocket, and I had carried it through 9 hours of held breath while she kept me and 129 other men alive, and I needed somehow to set the stone down. I am not a man who finds words easily. I told her I had been wrong about her on the pier the day we sailed. I told her I had agreed with the captain in my heart and that I had been ashamed of it ever since the destroyer's screws first rolled over our heads. I told her I had thought I was the finest set of ears in the silent service and that I knew better now. She looked at me for a moment, that still water look, and then she said the thing I have carried with me through every year since in place of the stone. She said the deep had been teaching me the same lesson it had taught her, and that I had simply learned mine a little later, and that there was no shame in learning late so long as you learned. She said the sea does not care how loud a man's pride is. It only ever asks how long he can stay quiet, and how well he has done his work in the dark where no one is watching. Then she shook an old chief's hand and she walked up the pier into the morning sun, and the last of the night's stars were gone from the sky by the time she reached the top. I served 11 more months and then I retired, and I have spent the years since in a small house near the water, And on clear nights I still go out and look up at the same stars she steered by, the quiet ones, the ones you can only see if you let your own eyes go still. I think of her every time. I think of the staff officer frozen at his salute on the pier, and I think of 9 hours of held breath in the shadow of the coronal bank. But mostly I think of a quiet young officer crouched beside my chair in the dark, listening to a hunter's mind, teaching an old proud man the one true thing about his own trade without ever once raising her voice to do it. The deep does not reward the loud. It rewards the patient, and it rewards the one who has done the work in the dark, and it gives the straight every time to whoever can stay quiet the longest. I learned that late, but I learned it. And I have never once in all the years since said the name fathom any way but the way you say a word you have finally come to understand.